The unexpected arrival was supposed to be just another day in the Warzone. The enemy forces had been in control for years. They ruled over this part of the galaxy with an iron fist, crushing anything or anyone who dared to challenge them. Their reputation was built on fear, and they had made sure no one would ever question their power. But today, something was different. No one saw it coming. No one could have predicted it. The enemy's command centers buzzed with activity as usual, and their ships continued to patrol the outer edges of the Warzone. They were so sure of themselves, they never expected anything to change. They believed they were untouchable, and then the sky changed. It started with a strange signal, quiet, almost like a whisper across the comms. At first, it was dismissed, just some interference, maybe a glitch in the system. But then the signal grew stronger, and within minutes, the enemy's entire fleet was on high alert. What was this? Who could be sending such a powerful signal into their domain? That's when they saw it. A fleet of ships, unlike anything they had ever seen before, appeared on the edge of the Warzone. At first, it was a single ship, a dark silhouette against the vast expanse of space, but then more ships followed, each emerging from the darkness like shadows. It was as though the very fabric of space itself had torn open to release them. The enemy ships stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the fleet grew larger. These were not ships they recognized, nor were they ships they could fight. The human fleet had arrived. The first shot came out of nowhere. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a test. It was a direct strike, swift and deadly. The enemy's most advanced defense ship didn't stand a chance. The moment the human fleet's weapon fired, the ship exploded into a burst of light, vaporizing into pieces so small that they could barely be seen. The enemy had no time to react. Before they could even process what had just happened, more shots rang out, targeting their command ships. The enemy commanders scrambled, trying to get control of their fleets, trying to make sense of the chaos, but it was too late. The human fleet was already on them, firing in quick succession, each shot hitting with perfect precision. At that moment, fear swept through the enemy ranks. They had never experienced such an attack before. Their ships were fast, but these human ships were faster. Their weapons were powerful, but these human weapons were more advanced, more devastating. The humans didn't just fight. They dominated. The Warzone, once a place of order and control, now felt like a battleground of the unknown. The enemy's fleets were being torn apart, and their leaders were starting to panic. What were these humans? Where had they come from? How were they able to strike so effectively? Meanwhile, on the human ships, everything was calm. The soldiers moved with purpose, executing their commands flawlessly. They weren't just invading, they were sending a message. A message that said, no one, not even the most powerful forces in the galaxy, were safe. The humans didn't waste any time. Their ships surged forward with incredible speed, weaving through the Warzone with deadly precision. The enemy's ships, despite their size and power, were no match for the human fleet's agility. Every move seemed calculated, as if the humans knew exactly what the enemy was going to do before they even thought it. A voice crackled through the comms of the human fleet, cold and firm. Targeting primary command ship, one shot, make it count. There was no hesitation. The crew members on board the human ships were focused, their hands steady as they prepared their weapons. The enemy didn't stand a chance. The shot was fired, and within seconds, the command ship of the enemy fleet erupted into flames. The once mighty ship that had controlled this Warzone for years was now nothing more than a burning wreck. On the enemy side, their leaders were screaming for answers. They couldn't comprehend what was happening. How were the humans able to strike so fast, so efficiently? They hadn't even had a chance to react. The humans weren't just fighting. They were executing a flawless strategy, one that left no room for error. The enemy forces attempted to regroup, calling in reinforcements from every direction, but the humans were already there, already surrounding them. Their ships moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing, striking with precision and then fading into the darkness before the enemy could even retaliate. Every enemy ship that tried to escape was swiftly destroyed. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. The enemy had no idea who these humans were or what they wanted. But one thing was clear: they were not here for negotiations. They weren't here for peace talks. They were here to win, and win they would. As the battle raged on, the enemy's confidence began to crack. Their once unshakable belief in their superiority started to erode. For the first time in years, they were afraid. The tide of war had shifted, and they had no idea how to stop it. In the midst of this chaos, the human fleet moved in for the final strike. The Warzone, once their domain, was now the place where they would face their greatest loss. And the humans, they were just getting started. The attack begins. The enemy had no time to regroup. In the blink of an eye, the human fleet had dismantled their strongest lines of defense. There was no room for hesitation, no time for plans to be drawn. The battle had already begun. And the humans were winning far more quickly than anyone could have imagined. From the enemy command center, the situation was pure chaos. Desperate orders crackled through the airwaves, but none of them mattered. The human fleet was everywhere, moving too fast for the enemy to get a clear shot. Their ships, sleek and silent, cut through the war zone like ghosts. The vastness of space seemed to shrink under their relentless assault on the front lines. The enemy's fleet struggled to mount a counterattack. Their ships, once considered the pinnacle of military might, now felt outdated and slow. Every missile they launched was either dodged or destroyed before it even had a chance to hit its target. The enemy was not just losing. They were being crushed under the weight of a force they couldn't comprehend. The first enemy captain, whose ship had been one of the largest in the war zone, stared out of his viewports in disbelief. His sensors blinked with warnings as human ships appeared out of nowhere, phasing in and out of the shadows. No matter how many times he ordered his crew to fire, the humans simply weren't there anymore by the time the weapons discharged. It was as if they knew his every move before he made it. Report. The captain barked, his voice trembling. They're everywhere, sir, his first officer shouted back, eyes wide with panic. We can't get a lock on any of their ships, they're too fast. Too unpredictable. Suddenly, the first officer's words became irrelevant. A massive explosion rocked their ship and the lights flickered out. The captain was thrown to the floor, his ears ringing with the sound of metal twisting and groaning. His ship was in the middle of disintegration, breaking apart like a paper ship caught in a storm. Through the smoke and debris, the captain realized, with chilling clarity, the humans weren't just skilled fighters, they were perfectionists. Every shot, every movement was made with such deadly precision, there was no chance to escape. The ship, along with the captain, was now nothing more than a burning wreck. As this scene played out in the vast emptiness of space, the human fleet continued its systematic assault. The strategy was clear: destroy the enemy's leadership, sever their command structure, and leave them in complete disarray. Every move the humans made was carefully calculated to disable and destroy the enemy's will to fight. Meanwhile, aboard the flagship of the human fleet, Commander Callan stood calmly on the bridge, watching the war zone unfold. There was no rush in his eyes, no fear in his movements. The battle had begun, and he knew they would win. This was not a mere fight, it was a demonstration. A demonstration of humanity's strength, of their resolve, and of their superiority. In the cosmos, prepare for the next wave, Callan ordered, his voice steady and clear. We'll break their final defenses. The war zone is ours. The officers around him moved swiftly, executing their tasks with military precision. The atmosphere on the bridge was tense but controlled. It was as if they were in the middle of a carefully orchestrated dance, each person knowing their place, their role, and the ultimate goal: victory. As the human fleet launched another round of devastating attacks, the enemy commanders began to panic. The enemy's once proud capital ship, the Ravager, had been their most formidable weapon in the war, a ship feared across the galaxy. Now, it was nothing more than a vulnerable target. Their largest and most powerful ship was crumbling under the human onslaught. Shields at 30%, the Ravager's tactical officer shouted, "We can't hold much longer. What should we do, Captain?" The captain's mind raced, but no answers came. The humans had already adapted to every tactic they tried. Their ships were ghostly, appearing where the enemy least expected them, striking with unmatched precision and speed. The enemy's shields were failing, their weapons useless, and their morale was quickly collapsing. Inside the enemy's war room, despair began to spread. Like a disease, the once unified leaders now looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed. Their once proud fleet was being dismantled in mere minutes. They had underestimated the human fleet, and now they were paying the price. But even as their ships fell, some of the enemy commanders held onto a sliver of hope. They knew the humans would eventually make a mistake. There had to be a weakness, a flaw in their seemingly flawless strategy. All they needed was one shot, one mistake to turn the tide. They just had to find it. As the battle raged on, the humans continued to push forward, relentlessly dismantling the enemy's forces. The enemy's ships tried to regroup, firing back in desperation, but it was futile. Every counterattack was met with a devastating response. The humans were like a tide, unstoppable, flooding the battlefield with precision strikes and calculated destruction. For the human fleet, this was just another day in their mission. They weren't here for glory, they weren't here for revenge, they were here because the galaxy had underestimated them. The humans were here to prove they could not be ignored, that they would not be pushed aside. As the enemy forces scrambled to respond, they realized something terrible. There was no escape. Their once dominant fleet was now a shadow of its former self, broken and lost, and the humans were just getting started. The final moments of this battle would not be marked by a last stand, but by an undeniable truth: the Warzone was no longer theirs. It belonged to the human fleet, and there was nothing the enemy could do to change that. Asterisk: the enemy strikes back. For the first time since the attack began, the enemy started to organize. Despite the overwhelming power of the human fleet, they were not completely defeated, they were desperate. But desperate forces can be unpredictable and dangerous. As their ships continued to burn in space, the enemy's commanders tried to take control of the situation, calling for reinforcements. The human fleet had made quick work of the front lines, but now the enemy was throwing everything they had left into the fray. They knew that if they couldn't stop the human fleet here, they would lose everything. This was their final chance to make a stand. The enemy's remaining ships formed a defensive line, focusing all their firepower on the human forces advancing toward them. New weapons systems, previously kept in reserve, came online. Massive energy beams shot out from the remaining enemy ships, crackling through space like lightning. Explosions erupted, shaking the Warzone as the enemy launched their retaliation. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the human fleet might falter. The sheer force of the enemy's counterattack was unlike anything they had faced so far. Ships that had been impervious to damage earlier now took hits. Explosions rocked the human ships, throwing them off course. Shields at 70%, an officer reported, his voice steady but strained. "They're stronger than we thought." Commander Callan's face remained calm as he observed the situation from the bridge of the flagship. He wasn't concerned. The human fleet had been prepared for this. They knew the enemy would retaliate, and they had accounted for it in their strategy. The enemy was strong, but they were predictable. The humans were not. "Divert power to the forward shields," Callan ordered. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers and keep pressing them." In the midst of the enemy's resurgence, the human fleet adapted. Their tactics shifted. Instead of pushing directly into the enemy's defenses, they spread out, attacking from multiple angles. The enemy didn't have enough ships to defend against this many attacks, and their counteroffensive began to lose steam. One by one, the enemy's retaliatory strikes began to fall short. Their ships were too slow to adjust to the human fleet's speed, and their weapon systems lacked the precision needed to land solid hits. Each shot from the enemy's fleet was met with a counterstrike, every beam of light from their guns being answered with fire that took down enemy ships in a flash. "Enemy fleet strength is decreasing," a second officer reported. "Their formations are falling apart, they're breaking." But just as the humans were about to capitalize on their advantage, something unexpected happened. The enemy launched a new weapon, one that had not been seen before. A massive energy cannon, far larger than anything in their usual arsenal, erupted from the belly of one of their flagship ships. It was a direct shot, aimed straight at the heart of the human fleet. The blast was so powerful that it momentarily disabled several of the human ships, sending them spiraling out of control. The attack was a desperate move, but it had been effective. The humans had not anticipated such a devastating weapon. The momentary loss of control allowed the enemy to regain their footing, and they pressed their advantage. However, Commander Callan was never one to let his fleet falter. Even in the chaos, he knew exactly what to do. "Status on the disabled ships?" he asked calmly. "They'll be back online in minutes, sir," came the response. "The damage was minimal." "Good," Callan said, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Let them think they have us cornered. It's part of the plan." For a brief moment, the enemy thought they had caught the human fleet off guard, but it was far from the truth. The human fleet had anticipated the possibility of a surprise weapon, and they had already prepared their countermeasures. The humans weren't just fighting this battle for victory. They were teaching their enemies a harsh lesson. In a matter of moments, the human fleet's tactical specialists had rerouted power to their shields and weapons, getting their ships back in the fight. Within seconds, they were back on the offensive, launching their own barrage of weapons at the weakened enemy ships. The battle raged on, but the tide was beginning to turn once more in favor of the humans. Despite the enemy's last-ditch efforts, their ships were being destroyed faster than they could regroup. The human fleet was too organized, too precise. No matter what the enemy threw at them, they simply couldn't keep up. And then, just when it seemed like the enemy might finally lose all hope, an unexpected ally appeared on the horizon. A lone ship, far larger than any other in the enemy fleet, moved slowly toward the battlefield. This was their final weapon, their last chance to turn the tide. The ship was colossal, its silhouette dwarfing even the largest of the remaining enemy vessels. It was a symbol of the enemy's desperation, and they were ready to gamble everything on this one massive strike. But the humans had seen it all before. "That ship is nothing," Callan muttered under his breath, his voice steady and unwavering. "We've faced worse." The human fleet tightened their formation, setting their sights on the new threat. The battle was far from over. But the enemy had just made their last mistake. They had underestimated the human fleet once again. The revelation amid the chaos of the battle. With ships bursting into flames and debris scattered across the war zone, something unexpected began to unfold. The enemy, despite their desperate measures, was running out of time. Their largest weapon, the giant flagship that had appeared from nowhere, was charging up for its final strike. But as it aimed its colossal energy cannon at the heart of the human fleet, there was a strange calm on the human ships. Commander Callan stood silent on the bridge of the flagship, his fingers lightly tapping the console. He had seen the desperate weapon the enemy had unleashed, their last-ditch effort to salvage a dying cause. The massive cannon had been built for destruction, yet, in a way, it no longer mattered. The enemy had revealed something critical, something that Callan and his fleet had been waiting for. "All ships, stand by, let them come," Callan ordered, his voice as composed as ever. The enemy flagship fired its massive cannon, a bolt of searing energy streaking through space like a comet aimed at the human fleet. The blast surged forward, shaking the battlefield as it sped toward the heart of the human formation. But just before impact, something extraordinary happened. With a sudden flash, the human fleet split in half. It wasn't by chance, it was a tactical maneuver, a perfect execution of what had been planned from the very start. The energy cannon, unable to lock onto a single target, missed its mark. The blast slammed harmlessly between two human ships, creating a massive shockwave that sent smaller enemy ships spiraling into oblivion. It was a brilliant move. And it wasn't just the human fleet's agility that had allowed them to dodge the attack, it was the technology behind their ships, technology the enemy could not have known about. Commander Callan watched as the human ships immediately reformed their positions, converging in unison around the enemy's giant flagship. A few moments ago, the enemy had believed they were in control. Now, they were surrounded. "Time to end this," Callan murmured. The true power of the human fleet had been revealed. The humans were not just stronger and faster. Their technology was far beyond anything the enemy had ever imagined. The weapons they wielded were not simply advanced, they were almost alien in nature, technology far ahead of the enemy's understanding. But that wasn't the only surprise. The human fleet wasn't here just to conquer. They were here to make a statement that would ripple across the galaxy, and echo in the halls of every power that had ever underestimated them. The Warzone was their proving ground, but the true purpose behind this battle was something much larger. The truth began to seep out slowly as the humans closed in on their target. The giant flagship that had been the centerpiece of the enemy's last hope was nothing more than a distraction. The humans hadn't come to fight a war, they had come to make sure no one could challenge them again. This battle wasn't about territorial conquest. It was about wiping the slate clean, erasing the past mistakes of the galaxy. Inside the command room of the enemy flagship, panic surged like wildfire. The generals who had once stood tall, confident in their superiority, were now scrambling. "What are they doing?" one of the commanders shouted, his face pale. "This isn't possible. They can't have this kind of power," but they did. The humans had revealed that they were not simply warriors, they were architects of a new era. They had something the enemy had never anticipated, the ability to rewrite the rules of warfare, to evolve, adapt, and strike with an intelligence and force that no one could match. As the enemy flagship's weapons started to power up for a last futile attempt at a counterattack, it was too late. The humans' fleet had already broken through their final line of defense. It was over. The human fleet moved in with a calm, calculated precision, completely undeterred by the enemy's final struggles. The flagship's massive energy cannon was fired one last time, but it was no longer aimed at anything of importance. The human fleet had already surrounded it, locking it in from every side. The cannons fired, and the enemy flagship disintegrated, its massive hull crumbling under the power of human technology. As the dust settled and the echoes of battle began to fade, the final piece of the enemy's resistance collapsed. The humans stood victorious, but as the last remnants of the enemy fleet were wiped out, something strange and unsettling lingered in the air. The war zone was silent, the enemy was gone. But the true revelation of this battle was clear now. More than ever, the humans weren't just fighting for survival, they were rewriting history. They were not just an unknown force in the galaxy. They were now the new rulers of the stars, and this was only the beginning. The turning point. Warzone, once a chaotic theater of destruction, had finally fallen into an eerie silence. The dust from shattered ships and the remnants of battle drifted across the emptiness of space, creating an unsettling calm. The human fleet stood victorious. But this victory came with an undeniable truth. The battle was only part of something far greater, far more significant than anyone had realized. The final enemy ship had crumbled into nothing but scattered debris. Yet, the lingering question on every mind within the human fleet was not about what they had destroyed, but what they had truly achieved. Commander Callan, standing tall and resolute on the bridge of the flagship, looked out into the vast expanse of the war zone. His expression was unreadable, his mind already planning the next move. But as his gaze swept across the remains of the enemy fleet, there was no satisfaction, no triumph. What had just happened wasn't just a fight for control, it was the beginning of a seismic shift, one that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. Prepare to move out, Callan's voice rang out calmly, breaking the heavy silence. The warzone may be secure, but our mission has only just begun. His orders were simple, yet filled with deeper meaning. While the world believed the war was over, Callan knew the humans had just opened the door to a new era. They had proven their strength, their superiority, but now they had to ensure that no one could ever challenge them again. What they had done here wasn't just about destruction. It was about making sure their message was received across the entire galaxy. The human fleet began to maneuver away from the wreckage. But even as the ships turned, moving toward the edge of the war zone, a strange feeling washed over the crew. It wasn't victory that held their thoughts, but a chilling realization. This power, this strength, came with a price. The first signs of that price came when a small, unidentified craft appeared on the outer edges of the war zone. It wasn't a ship of the enemy. In fact, it wasn't even a military craft at all. It was civilian, and unarmed, peaceful transport vessel. And yet, it wasn't just an innocent bystander. Its appearance signaled something much more profound. A message was being sent by the galaxy itself. Commander, we're receiving a transmission from that ship, the communications officer reported. It's not military, but it's clear it's trying to get our attention. Callan raised an eyebrow. His orders had been clear, the war zone was secure, and their presence was no longer needed. But this strange craft and the message it carried shifted his perspective. Something more was at play here. Something the human fleet had yet to fully understand. Put it through, Callan ordered. His voice steady but with an edge of curiosity. The screen flickered to life, and there, staring back at the crew, was an elderly man. He appeared frail, his hair and beard long and white, his face weathered by age, but his eyes, sharp and full of wisdom, held a quiet authority. This is Captain Ilian of the Intergalactic Union, the man said, his voice filled with an almost palpable tension. I come on behalf of a larger body and organization that governs the balance of power in the galaxy. You have proven your strength today, human fleet. But what you have done will not go unnoticed. Callan remained silent, his mind racing. The Intergalactic Union? This was an organization that had controlled the peace across the galaxy for centuries. The humans had always been on the fringes, on the outside, never fully accepted by the established powers, but now something had changed. Something bigger than just a war. Captain Ilian continued. You have broken the laws of neutrality. The galaxy is not ready for a power like yours. You've taken the war zone. But do you understand the consequences of your actions? Callan's grip tightened around the armrest of his command chair. He could feel the weight of the captain's words pressing on him. The human fleet had made a bold move. But now the true complexity of their victory was coming into focus. The question was no longer about who was in charge of the war zone. It was about what would happen to the galaxy now that humanity had taken its first step onto the path of domination. What are you asking, Captain Ilian? Callan finally responded, his voice calm but with a trace of authority. What consequences are we to face? Ilian's gaze darkened and his voice took on a more serious tone. You have drawn attention, Commander. You've awakened forces that were dormant. The Intergalactic Union will not sit idly by while you challenge the order of the galaxy. Your fleet is powerful, but it is not the only power. There are others, old alliances that were forged in the fires of war, and they will not allow a single force to rise unchecked. There it was, the first hint of resistance. The first sign that the galaxy was not going to just bend to humanity's will. The old powers had awakened and they were not going to let humanity's rise go unchallenged. I understand, Callan said quietly, his voice almost like a whisper. But I hope they understand that we don't intend to be just another power in the galaxy. We intend to be the power. Captain Ilian nodded solemnly. We shall see, Commander. But remember this, there are more consequences to your actions than you realize. The galaxy is a much bigger place than your fleet. You may have won today, but tomorrow is when the real battle begins. The transmission ended, and the screen went dark. The bridge of the human flagship was silent for a moment as the crew absorbed the weight of the conversation. The war zone had been a test, but this was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The galaxy was not as united as the humans had hoped, and now They were being forced to reckon with the reality of what their victory had set in motion. Prepare for departure, Callan finally said, his voice steady once again. The galaxy just got a whole lot bigger. The crew sprang into action, but beneath their professionalism, there was a quiet understanding. The true test for the human fleet had just begun. The path ahead was fraught with challenges. They had shattered one power, but many others lay in wait, watching closely, ready to act, and Callan knew that nothing was certain, not anymore. The final stand, the uneasy silence that followed the transmission from Captain Ilian hung in the air. Like a storm waiting to break, the human fleet had been thrust into a new reality, one where their actions had echoed across the galaxy, stirring forces that had long remained dormant. The calm of the Warzone was shattered, but in its place, something far more dangerous was rising, a galaxy on the brink of chaos. Now aware of humanity's strength, Commander Callan stood at the center of the bridge, staring out into the dark void of space. The stars flickered in the distance, their cold light offering no comfort. The fleet had done what it came to do: dominate the Warzone, defeat the enemy. But that victory was no longer enough. It was a message sent to the galaxy, a message that would either lead to a new order or ignite a new conflict. As the human fleet began to move away from the Warzone, their next destination uncertain, an alert flashed on the screen. Callan's eyes narrowed as he read the data. His instincts told him something was coming. Something even more dangerous than the enemy they had just defeated. Commander, a voice called out from the tactical station, we've detected several ships moving toward us, unknown fleet signatures, shields up. Callan ordered immediately. His voice sharp and calm, his thoughts raced, trying to anticipate the next move. The transmissions with Captain Ilian had left him uneasy. But this was something else. The enemy may have been defeated, but now it seemed that something far more powerful was on the horizon. The unknown fleet came into view, a vast array of ships. More than Callan had ever seen in one place. These weren't the standard ships of the enemy's forces. They were sleek, powerful, and clearly organized. The ships bore markings that were unfamiliar, and their presence sent a wave of unease through the crew. These ships aren't from the enemy we just defeated, the communications officer muttered, staring at the incoming fleet. There's something else. Open a channel, Callan commanded. The screen flickered to life again, revealing another elderly man, but this one was different. His face was not one of desperation, but of calm authority, and his voice carried the weight of experience. I am Admiral Valen of the Galactic Sovereignty, the man said, his tone cold and controlled. We've been watching you, Commander, and we've decided that it's time to meet. Callan's heart raced, but his face remained unchanged. The Galactic Sovereignty. The name alone sent a chill down his spine. They were one of the oldest, most powerful factions in the galaxy, a force of order and stability, but also one of conquest. The fact that they had come to meet the human fleet was both a threat and an opportunity. Admiral Valen, I don't believe we've met. You've come a long way, Callan said, his voice steady, masking the tension he felt. What is it you want? The Admiral's eyes glinted with a mix of amusement and disdain. What we want, Commander, is to ensure that humanity doesn't disrupt the delicate balance we've spent centuries maintaining. You've made your mark, and we can respect that. But you've also awakened something far bigger than yourself. Callan's jaw clenched, his mind working quickly to process the situation. The Admiral's words were meant to intimidate. They were meant to suggest that the humans were out of their league, stepping into territory where they had no business being. I'm not here to negotiate peace, Admiral, Callan replied firmly. I didn't come this far just to retreat. We've made our decision, and we're not backing down. The Admiral's expression darkened. Then prepare yourself, Commander. The Galactic Sovereignty does not negotiate with those who disrupt the order of the stars. This is your final stand. Before Callan could respond, the fleet opened fire. The enemy's ships, more advanced and deadly than anything the humans had ever faced, unleashed a barrage of energy beams. The human fleet immediately retaliated, their weapons firing with precision. But the enemy's firepower was overwhelming. The battle that unfolded was unlike any Callan had ever seen. It was a fight for survival, not just for control, but for the very future of humanity in the galaxy. Engage evasive maneuvers, Callan shouted, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The human fleet was skilled, yes, but they were facing a well-organized, seasoned force. This battle would not be as easy as the last. The enemy's ships closed in with a deadly accuracy, targeting the most vulnerable parts of the human fleet. Explosions rocked the human ships, but they did not falter. Their formations shifted, weaving and dodging as they countered the enemy's every move. But as the battle raged on, it became clear that the humans were being pushed back. The Galactic Sovereignty was relentless, their ships absorbing every attack and responding with terrifying force. The humans were strong, but they were no match for this kind of power, Commander. The tactical officer called, his voice urgent. The enemy is deploying their flagship. It's unlike anything we've seen, a massive ship, far larger than anything in the enemy fleet, emerged from the shadows. It was an enormous structure, more a fortress than a ship. The sheer size and firepower of the vessel was enough to intimidate even the most seasoned commanders. It was the final move, the moment that would decide the outcome of the battle. Callan took a deep breath, his mind racing. The enemy had underestimated the human fleet before, but now they were facing something new, something the galaxy had never seen. Target their flagship, Callan ordered, his voice unwavering. It's now or never. All ships, full assault. We don't stop until we take that ship down. The human fleet surged forward, launching everything they had left. The battle reached a fever pitch as the two fleets clashed in a storm of energy and steel. The human fleet, battered but not broken, pushed forward with everything they had. The flagship of the enemy loomed large, its weapons firing relentlessly. But Callan knew that this was their moment. It had to be. This wasn't just about winning. This was about proving that the humans could not be stopped. They were no longer just a force to be reckoned with. They were a force that could change the galaxy forever. Aftermath and the human and pirate battle raged on for hours. The clash of energy blasts and the deafening sounds of exploding ships creating a symphony of chaos. The human fleet, battered but unbroken, pushed forward with a fury that none of the other factions had anticipated. Commander Callan stood at the helm, his eyes never leaving the battle unfolding before him. This was no longer just a fight for victory, it was a fight for survival. For the future of humanity. The flagship of the Galactic sovereignty, massive and imposing, had been the focal point of the battle. Its weapons were unlike anything the humans had faced, but their determination had only grown stronger with each passing moment. Every shot fired from the human fleet was another step toward dismantling the enemy's overwhelming force. But as the flagship faltered and the tide of battle began to shift, something unexpected happened. In the final moments of the clash, the Galactic sovereignty flagship exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The shockwave rippled through the Warzone, sending shockwaves through the remaining enemy ships. The once mighty flagship, a symbol of the old order, was gone, and with it, the heart of the Galactic sovereignty's power. For a moment, there was silence. The human fleet had done it. They had torn down the might of the Galactic sovereignty and stood victorious. But this victory, unlike the others, felt different. The victory was not just about crushing an enemy fleet. It was about shifting the very fabric of the galaxy. The old powers were no more. Humanity was now the new force in the galaxy. Commander Callan stood on the bridge, gazing at the screen as the remnants of the enemy fleet fled into the unknown. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. The universe was changing, and humanity had proven that they were no longer outsiders. They were the new rulers of the stars. Status report, Callan said, his voice steady. The tactical officer looked up from his console, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sir, the enemy fleet is scattering. Their remaining ships are retreating. The Galactic sovereignty has lost control of this sector. Their forces are in disarray. Callan nodded. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment when humanity could take its place at the table of galactic powers. But even as he stood there, victorious, a strange feeling lingered in the back of his mind. The Warzone was no longer just a battlefield, it was a symbol of what humanity could accomplish. They had broken through the walls that had kept them out, but now they faced an even greater challenge, maintaining their newfound dominance. Are the reinforcements ready? Callan asked. Yes, sir, came the reply. We've dispatched additional ships to secure the outer territories. We've also received signals from several neighboring sectors. They're eager to establish contact. Callan's mind raced. The galaxy was vast, and now it was full of opportunities. The battle for the Warzone was only the beginning. It was time for humanity to stake their claim on the galaxy, but it would not be easy. The galactic sovereignty may have fallen, but there were other powers hidden, ancient factions that had long ruled in the shadows. They would not simply bow to humanity's rise. Prepare to make contact with the other sectors. Callan ordered, we're going to need allies. And we'll need to show them that humanity is not to be ignored. As the human fleet began its journey beyond the Warzone, the remnants of the old power structure scattered. There was no longer a single dominant force in the galaxy. The sovereignty's defeat was just the first ripple in a wave of change that would soon sweep across the stars. The galaxy had no idea what it was about to face. The old alliances would fracture, new alliances would form. And humanity, once just a forgotten speck in the universe, was now a force to be reckoned with. Back aboard the flagship, the crew began to regroup. They had won, but the reality of what they had just accomplished was sinking in. The galaxy was not a place that would simply bend to their will. The challenges ahead were vast, and they would face obstacles unlike any they had encountered before. But Commander Callan knew one thing for certain: humanity was not going to back down. They had proven themselves worthy of taking their place among the stars. They had earned their seat at the table. The crew moved quickly, preparing the fleet for the journey ahead. They would need to secure more territory, establish diplomatic ties, and confront the dangers that still lurked in the galaxy's far corners. The galaxy was now their battleground, and they were ready to conquer. But as the fleet moved forward, a shadowy figure stood in the darkness, watching from afar. The galaxy was vast, and its secrets ran deep. There were still forces at play that humanity had not yet encountered. The true test of their power had only just begun.